Micro, and welcome to episode 24 of the Trend Talks BizSec series. Along with me is Ed Cabrera, Chief Cybersecurity Officer at Trend Micro. Ed, how are you today?
Doing fantastic with a great guest.
Exactly. And today we have a special guest with us, Craig Jones, who is the Director of Cybercrime at Interpol. We're going to talk a lot about law enforcement activities around the world and what Interpol has been doing to keep us safe and arrest these malicious actors and adversaries that we're dealing with on a regular basis. Craig, why don't you introduce yourself, a little bit of what your background and what you've been doing lately at Interpol?
Yeah, thanks very much, and really pleased to be having a conversation with you two this afternoon from a very wet and soggy New York, actually. So I'm currently the Director of Cybercrime at Interpol. I've been here for just over 4 years now. I'm a seconded law enforcement official from the United Kingdom, so that means I've been borrowed from my home agency, which is a national crime agency. And my job there previously was a senior manager within their national cybercrime unit. So the equivalency would be sort of like the FBI, effectively, in terms of federal responsibility. I've got a track record, I suppose, the last 10, 12 years in cyber, building teams primarily to do investigations to start with and running operations and investigations. And then I'm sort of, as you move through, ended up in the strategy side, working very closely with the government on the UK cyber strategy, but also where the UK combined, shall we say, some of the agencies together with law enforcement to make that whole of system, whole of government approach. And then coming into Interpol 4.5 years ago as a director, my role here really is to lead and drive our global cybercrime program. So that's setting out the vision, which has to be in line with the overall organization, and supporting our 195 member countries. Interpol, for those that don't know, we're a neutral organization. People hear about the red notices, and you see the film Red Notice, and it is just like that. No, it's not really. Our role primarily is connecting policing for a safer world. So our role is to bring together the law enforcement, but also now we're moving more and more into other partners, and this is where working with organisations, companies such as Trend Micro, are so vital in countering and combating cybercrime. So the program that we have as a mandate of reducing the global impact of cybercrime and protecting communities for a safer world. So every conversation I have with external entities, with partners internally, is how can we do that on a daily basis? And that's looking at the cybercrime that's causing high harm, high impact, high volume and high interest. And we'll probably dig into that a little bit. Yeah. But then also it's doing the government work as well. So currently I'm sat here at the United Nations. There is a new crime convention being negotiated at the United Nations, and this is the first time in over 20 years there's been a convention looks like it's going to come through, and that's really important for law enforcement. Now, the title of a convention is a little bit long, so it's a new international convention to counter the use of information and communications technology for criminal purposes. And again, this is where we get into that wording. What does cybercrime mean? What's information communications technology? So this convention is going to hopefully have some of those definitions in there. So then we start using a language which we can apply globally, which helps me trying to run a global program in talking to countries, but also when we're working with private partners. So we're here for 2 weeks. The process has been going on for 18 months. I head our sort of delegation here, and we are here to provide that global voice for law enforcement. So what are the challenges we face? How can we look at overcoming some of these? But also another really important part of this is how does the private sector work in this space? And whether that's the ISPs and others that hold the data sets, or partnering with organizations that basically hold that data which law enforcement are not able to gather. We're not able to work effectively in that space. And the side part of that then is, how does law enforcement work now globally, locally and regionally in this space? So that's a little bit of the background.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us into the first question I had, Craig, which is, how has law enforcement community kind of changed over the last several years? Obviously, technology goes so fast, and these criminals that operate all over the world. But how have you seen the change? Is it getting better, getting worse, kind of the same?
I suppose seminal point for me was 2017 was WannaCry, and it comes back to those crimes that are high impact, but more importantly, high interest. And it certainly gets government's attentions when their communities are directly impacted and the communities go, whoa, what are you doing? And certainly with WannaCry, we saw there was not really a true global coordinated response by law enforcement through no one's fault. This isn't a criticism. This is more the maturity at that time. We were working in silos, in pockets, countries that were like-minded would have conversations together. But actually, this is where the Interpol piece, I think, is really important at the global level and also regional, being able to bring those countries together. And I sort of have a triangle model. My triangle is probably about 15 to 30 countries at the top of my triangle, good capability, good capacity, can do an investigation, but often can't talk to each other because of geopolitics. So Interpol's role then is to come in at that level, and that has improved. Then we've got a middle tranche of countries got some capability, some capacity, and how can we work with them more effectively in regions and setting up regional desks? And we'll probably touch on that a little bit later. But then there's a big tranche of countries there that just do not have the capability or capacity. And as those countries have become more digitalized, therefore the criminals are causing more harm, and normally, as we know, financial. And we've seen the sort of rise of ransomware. All ransomware is a network intrusion, an encryption of data, and an extortion, and we've got different levels of that now. So, you know, we've seen that model move, but we still have those phishing, business email compromise. Those sort of attacks are still ongoing, and they are causing high financial loss. But as law enforcement, our recording processes aren't so good as well. So coming back to, you need these moments, and I think in the US, Colonial Pipeline was a moment for the US where, whoa, hang on a second, something really serious here. And that was just shortly after the IST had done their report about ransomware. So that sort of brought a whole plethora of agencies together in the US. And now that's sort of radiating out globally. And you now have the Counter Ransomware Initiative under the umbrella of the US. The US now have a new national cyber strategy. The US now have an implementation plan. So we see countries at different levels effectively. And part of what this convention at the UN is recognizing that. And within the convention, they'll be looking at putting things about capacity, technical assistance to countries. And again, there'll be provisions in that, which, you know, some countries are up here and top part of my triangle. How do we then leverage those into other countries? How do we support? And again, that comes back to Interpol's role and the sort of 4 objectives we have in our program.
No, I think, Craig, you make some great points. Obviously, personally, you know, working 20 years in the Secret Service, you know, I personally can really attest to the great working relationship that we had, obviously, with you throughout my career with Interpol and all the sort of investigative support that we provided and continue to provide, and Secret Service does it to this day. But even more so now, been at Trent for almost 8 years. I think it's been a fantastic sort of relationship that we've developed with you too. The one thing I want to say is just one is a big compliment, because I think I remember during that time or those years, it was great operational support and engagement with Interpol, but I like the way you guys are actually targeting and really focusing on the strategic piece. So rather actually more the tactical and case-by-case support, but the operational strategic sort of engagement that you guys are doing specifically at the UN, even broader, to really tackle the bigger issues. I applaud you guys, fantastic. And so I guess my question is has that transition been a tough one? Because, you know, we talk about, you sort of talked about the pyramid and having countries at a certain level, and it's hard to exchange threat intelligence and information, you know, with countries that might not have the capacity or the people to be able to even handle, say, you know, support for an ongoing investigation, much less something more strategic and on like the convention that you're working on now for the Cybercrime Convention. So what has been the biggest challenge in doing that for you guys?
Yeah, so thanks very much, Ed. I mean, it's really, really nice compliments. For me, it's keep it simple. So, you know, do what it says on the tin. Effectively, communities are being harmed. So the law enforcement model we have is protection of life and property, and prevention of crime. So within our strategy, we have 4 areas that we work under: prevention, detection, investigation, and disruption. And we take that back to people, process, and technology. So the first part is around the process for me. So having a very clear strategy. So that mandate that we have that I talked about, but then sort of 4 key objectives. First of all, understanding the threat landscape. So what is it where we've been harmed? And again, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because you're looking at a global level, then you have to distill it down into a regional level. And coming back to my triangle, those countries at the bottom are not going to be able to carry out an investigation. That is not a criticism again. That is actually, we can pull some data sets from them which help us in that threat assessment. Then the next part is that the operational side. So how do we then provide actual intelligence into the countries? We do that with private partners, 100%. You know, we're able to aggregate law enforcement data sets. Do we truly aggregate law enforcement data sets? Do law enforcement share data? We'll leave that one hanging. But, you know, I know the private partners we have, you know, such as Trend Micro, such as LAC NEC, BT, Kaspersky, Group IB, Palo Alto, and we're looking at some more. We have now very clear data sharing agreements with them. Interpol has a thing called rules of processing data, which the document's about that thick. And as we know around how do we share data, we have to be have rules in that. So any police data that comes into Interpol remains the property of the country that is sharing that data with us. So we don't own the data, we become the custodians. And that country can stipulate who that data is shared with, who it's not to be shared with as well. And likewise with our private partners, when we work with our private partners, as you know, we look at the threat, we say, okay, well, how can we look at an operation on that? You know, who are the threat actors, where's the infrastructure, where are the victims? And then we can build up an operation. And we do that through our threat response center in Singapore, which again, Trend Micro supports us in terms of personnel, in terms of infrastructure. You know, being able to have that in one place is critical. But then we deliver the operations regionally and also locally. By locally, I mean nationally. So we have regional desks set up. And the model is in our 4 regions: the Americas, Europe, Africa, Asia, and South Pacific. So the Africa desk is probably the best example at the moment. We have funding from a UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, and what that pays for is seconded officials and contract staff, and then we have them embedded in our regional bureaus. So Interpol has an office in every country. And the Interpol offices are made up by local law enforcement. So they answer to their own national entities, but they're able to use Interpol tools and platforms, and they're secure tools and platforms. So the way we share our data now in operations over the last few years, you know, we used to do it on WhatsApp, on email, Gmail. Now we've got a secure collaborative platform for operations where we can bring countries onto a secure platform. We can also bring the private partners onto that platform as well. And that is about creating communities to protect communities, which is another strand of our sort of activities. This is about how do we partner, who do we partner with, you know, who are the best partners. I don't want to receive volume data. That for me causes challenges. I want to have that sort of distilled data from different private partners. We then work with the police and the private partners to then do that actual intelligence. So we push that through into our regional desk. So in Africa, 2019, I sat in a classroom with 12 people. Trend Micro were there, actually, and a couple of other private partners. And that was the level of our desk at that time. 12 heads of national cybercrime units. Now, 2022 in Rwanda, we had about 40 heads of cybercrime there. We carried out some training as well for teams. We then turned that into an operation. And that's the other part, is the sustainability model. Quite often you'll see governments pouring money into these projects, capacity building, technical assistance. You know, they go in, but trust me, the police like doing a course. We like a nice certificate to hang on the wall, a nice badge. But after that week, everybody goes away. So what we do now, any training has to come with an operational outcome. So last year in Rwanda, we looked at compromised infrastructure in ISPs, and we trained the police there about how to go and do that. Just in Tanzania, the last few weeks, we've had Surge 2.0, and this time we've done a similar model, but also we've had, you know, 14 odd arrests. We've identified and, you know, stopped about $40 million going through and into criminal hands. So that comes back to that aggregator effect, as you said, Ed. And that's the model, whether we're doing it or whether we have our partners such as Europol. Again, that's a really good, solid organization, because guess what? They have legislation, they have joint funding, they're able to work as a collective. But what we're able to do is to reach into those other countries as well, which countries may not be able to reach into.
Wow, that's awesome. And you mentioned the African surge. I know, you know, we supported that with y'all to bring down that infrastructure, get those arrests. So that's it seems to be working. So, but one question I have, Craig, is what do you think could be a major contributor to minimizing cybercrime moving forward? Is it better sentencing? Is it better cooperation across places? Because obviously we know, you know, these adversaries are all over the world, so
yeah,
can be a little difficult.
Yeah, I think that there's no silver bullet to this. So I think this is why we've structured it in 4 ways: prevention, detection, investigation, and disruption. So if I just take the prevention piece first of all, this is about, you know, how do we act securely when we're online? So the first onus is on individuals, and then organizations or anybody that's, you know, connected online. You know, what do we do about our physical security? I just had an incident here. I was locked out of the office. I didn't have the key to get in the office, but that stopped me or anybody else coming into the office. So there was a security measure in place, which, you know, was frustrating. But I then went and got the key and I can come into the office. So in terms of when we want to get online, and my kids are a good example. My oldest is 25, my youngest is 21. My 25-year-old just missed that sort of explosion on the what I call the social media networks. And the social media side of this now, and the use of that, and shall we say, some people's ability to overshare, shall we say. But when you look at that, people are doing that because they think they're safe, everything's fine. And that permeates through lots of different levels. I also hear people saying, it's okay, these generations, they get it. No, they're the biggest abusers. You know, that's why on the technical side, I think, and the US strategy's highlighted this, and the US are the only ones I've seen put this out there so far. 2 points. First one is around, you know, it shouldn't be down to an individual or small company to have to protect themselves so much. You know, the onus is on about passwords, patching, etc. There's a lot going on. The second part of that is around the providers, so the software providers, you know, making sure that the software that's provided is secure. So I would call it safety by design. I don't call it security by design, because for me, the language as well puts a lot of people off. I speak to my mum. My dad's just recently passed away, but my dad used, you know, when he retired, his life was online and he got it. But what he didn't get was this technical language. So it's a lot about is trying to bridge the technical side and the business side. I think my computer's just to run down out of battery. I'm gonna have to read down. This is live, folks. Sorry. There we go.
No worries.
Yeah, it's bridging that. That's another thing. You know, if you don't want to have a cybercrime committed, don't go online. But that's another story. But yeah, it's trying to get that awareness, and I think that at the higher level, as we said, in boardrooms. And I've seen it when I used to do investigations. I'll go into an organization that, you know, had a ransomware attack, and it was effectively, it's like almost your child effectively has been taken away. So that's why, yeah, ransomware works very well, because, you know, there is an extortion going on. But you used to see these people say, how us? So you then go, what did you have in place? And I think we talk a lot about exercising and training, you know, making sure those procedures are in place within companies, but more importantly, making sure you test them. And right. It's not about, you know, catching people out. It's about, you do not want to pull that playbook out the first time when it's for real. So there's a lot of different measures that can put in place of this. So part of this is down to, you know, governments, down to industry, down to law enforcement. And just coming back to your point about, you know, the sort of sentencing side of this, doesn't work, because we don't get enough people arrested. No. So when we look at this, we do have to put pressure on other countries that may not have the same judicial system. So Nigeria, they wanted to arrest the people that are committing crime in their countries, which is why we're able to work with partners like Trend Micro, provide information into them, then work with countries that had victims from the offenders that were based in Nigeria, and they did lots of arrests. That model works everywhere, and they wanted to arrest the people in the communities. When I see countries unsealing indictments and saying, these people here are bad, we're unsealing the indictment, we'll put sanctions. Yeah, great. Now that, shows they've done an investigation. But part of what my role at Interpol is saying to those countries, right, give us those indictments, allow Interpol through, we only deal with crime, to go into those countries and start having those conversations. We've also layered text out within our organization. So we have a constitution, we have a General Assembly where we put resolutions. 2021, we did our own sort of mini version of this new crime convention around cyber. Tick, all the countries signed up to it. At our regional statutory meetings, they've also signed up to it. And then at our heads of National Central Bureau. So we have effectively 5 pieces of paper now where all of our 195 member countries said, yeah, we want to counter and combat cybercrime. We want to prevent, we want to detect, we want to investigate, and we want to disrupt. So as we move forward, we will start using that and holding countries to account. And countries have to hold themselves to account as well when we look at the prioritization. So it's quite often we say, well, it's really tricky, it's really difficult. And yeah, it is, but what's the priority? And again, I think if you do a similar piece to counterterrorism, why is that so effective? Unfortunately, in counterterrorism, people are killed, maimed, injured. So that, countries will then put resource into that. As long as we sort of, it's that business write-off, there's a certain amount that can be written off. But the US, again, did a good job. I think it was last year, the year before in Florida, as a NetWalker affiliate was arrested. And I think it's from Canada. And I read the judgment, and the judge said, if you had not pleaded guilty, you would have got life. And he got 18 years and about a $21 million fine. The ripple effect. So whilst I said arrest doesn't work, it does when you get it at the right level, but then you follow that up as well. So he then had a judicial outcome. He has now been locked up. The money has been taken as well. And that's one of the key things on our disruption piece is disruption of the technical infrastructure, but we don't want to break the internet, but disrupting the money flows, so stopping that money getting into the criminals' hands. That's why they're there for it at the end of the day.
Ed, you're muted.
Sorry. I think you mentioned some very important things. You got to be a network to defeat a network, right? So I think that the partnership piece, the public-private partnership piece, I'm very happy that that has really expanded. But I think to your point is, and what we're looking at, what's effective. I've always said that the arrest is always this delayed gratification. So there's the level of deterrence that actually happens when somebody's arrested is there, but it's definitely, subdued because some of the acts could be 5 years or the arrest could be 5 years after the acts. And so, people's memory are very short, and there's many more attacks that happened, in between that time frame. So I think what you say is really important. And I love the work that you guys are doing in Africa. So could you talk about a little bit more about the surges and the operations that you've done in Africa?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the whole purpose of the Africa desk, when we set it up, was we done an initial threat assessment. We saw that effectively, as Africa became more digitalized, there were going to be more potential victims. So we looked at it from a prevention piece. We then looked at the threat actors that were already operating in Africa. Now, like any sort of organized crime group, you have different levels, and you start at the lowest level. But one of the important things if you look in Africa is the sort of the commerce and the economic situation. So you've got people in Africa that got virtually little or no money. And just by, having access to a phone, so this comes back to that digitalization piece, open up opportunities, one for businesses, but also for criminals. And the criminals jumped on it. And we've seen for many years now the emails coming in from the Nigerian prince inheriting money. But that was not what I would say is like a technical attack. Now they're getting the technical capabilities. So you're getting these groups, and we saw it in Eastern Europe. You have villages effectively that their main economy is based on committing crime online. And this is now happening in Africa. So we're trying to look at it through the prevention and the diversion side is one part of this. The second part is around the disruption. So whether it's the infrastructure, and that's very much on the surge. What we did there was we looked at infrastructure, which was enabling. We then looked at the crime groups that are operating in Africa. So part of it was sort of doing the training for law enforcement, so much as we did in Rwanda last year and Tanzania this year as well. And we did it in a coordinated way. So we've got our, as I said, the threat response team in Singapore, the head of the Africa desk, our regional officers come together, they run workshops. We've also created a framework for Africa, and that's really important because now they have a clear framework that they all work together to counter and combat cybercrime. So under our strategy of prevention, detection, investigation, and disruption, we pick out clear objectives that they can do within that. So we've seen some great prevention work going on, first of all, where they're going out into the communities and identifying those vulnerabilities within communities, i.e. new businesses setting up. So a lot of that education piece is going on. On the detection side, this is where the private partners come in. You know, you folks provided us with that information, which we would not be able to get access to. And the detection side is around, okay, well, what are we seeing hitting Africa, but also what are we seeing coming out? That then leads into the third part, which is the investigation, which is what we did here. So we had multiple investigations. It wasn't just one small case. But again, then that comes into that capacity. And for me, there's a difference between capacity and capability. The capacity is how much can you do, but you've got to have a very clear capability that you have. So sometimes we can do a lot, but the capability is not actually going to impact that much. So where do we balance the capability and capacity bit? And then we come into the disruption. So in the surge case, we did the disruption of infrastructure. And sometimes that was going down the law enforcement or the judicial route around going into the internet service providers and saying, you know, this is illegal, take it down. Or the other side is using the sort of the T's and C's that, you know, the hosters have with the host who they're hosting. And quite often there's some really good terms and conditions in there. And once you look at the small print and go through the small print and you've been able to provide the evidence, say, well, look, this and this is not in line with that terms and condition, you should be terminating that contract. That's a different type of disruption effectively. But then what we have to do is pull those data sets out as well, because those breadcrumbs, which then we can move into different operations and different investigations, and whether we're then handing that over to our colleagues in the Financial Crimes and Anti-Corruption Directorate who are looking at the financial side. And certainly, you know, we could probably have a whole day talking about virtual assets and virtual currency and how criminals move that. But again, yes, that's another area where we can take out those primary pieces and then put that into secondary and third sort of tertiary investigations. So that in Africa, that surge operation followed a number of different tracks effectively.
Fascinating. The one follow-up question there, you mentioned obviously following the money, right? We know historically, you know, FATF has, you know, going after the money laundering aspect. Do you find that aspect, because you also mentioned going after terrorism and terrorist cells and so forth, and that is very sort of akin to what we see in many different parts of the world, specifically Russian-speaking cybercrime or criminal undergrounds, where they come together and operate quite well and are able to leverage trust and anonymity or pseudo-anonymity very well. Are you looking at increasing the ability, especially even on the convention side of the house, of really sort of paving the way to go after the money to be a much quicker way of getting after these groups?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just touched on our Interpol Financial Crimes and Anti-Corruption Centre. So that was purposely set up, I think, last year now. One of their key pieces is around the sort of financial crime aspect and also the money, whether it's in counterterrorism, whether it's in cybercrime. So having our teams combined together like we have in Singapore is absolutely vital. And that comes back to that information sharing and that data flow. But also, as I sort of mentioned about the red notices early, well, we're also looking at doing I can't use the word silver notice, but that's the internal term we're using. But how do we get that information out quickly when we see that money moving? How do we then contact the different financial investigation units in other countries? And again, that's where the Interpol tools and channels come into that. That's why having seconded officials and contract staff that are explicitly working on these types of cases are able to share that data really quickly. We work very closely now with FATF as well. So coming back to that law enforcement model maturing, we know we've got to reach into other organizations because they have the key to the door effectively. But what they don't necessarily have is that law enforcement element where we can quickly go into law enforcement. So we, for example, we have a 24/7 network of sort of cybercrime contacts in countries. We can share those quickly. They're doing the same on the financial side. So very much one of the key components at the moment is, what's going to hurt the criminals? Stopping the money. Absolutely. And we've got numerous successes in that. Just recently, I think there were a couple of cases that were going through Hong Kong. So being able to reach into Hong Kong very quickly and turn that money off through the financial institutions. And this isn't about necessarily dragging that money straight back. It's just stopping it going through processes. And, I haven't seen many criminals complaining or making official complaints when the money's stopped. So, it comes with checks and balances. And I should say this is one important factor for Interpol. We have a lot of checks and balances in place, and we have to have that. We have a lot of access. We have a lot of tools. We have a lot of rules to cover these things. We sometimes I read them and I think, that's going to put another. But actually, that layer needs to be put in there because we've got the human rights to consider on this side of it as well. So a lot of checks and balances go into our work as well.
Yeah, that's great to hear. You mentioned obviously we talk about cybercrime as a global issue. How do you deal with it when the criminals are in regions of the world where you kind of have a tough time to get access to? Yeah. Maybe there's not extradition capability from those countries. How do you typically go about trying to get these folks arrested?
So this is where, Interpol does not do everything. We are a multinational, an international organization. I have no executive. I can't run an investigation operation now. So what we do is, and I'll give an example. There was a country that unsealed 3 indictments on 3 cyber criminals. They're very clear in their language. They unsealed the indictment. They called them out as cyber criminals. They then also called them out as committing crime in the country where the indictments were unsealed. They then also called them out for committing crime in the country where they were based. And that's one of the first times I've heard someone do that. So what I was then saying to the country is, okay, how can Interpol assist? How can Interpol now take those indictments? We're not going to execute them, but I can then go into that country and coming back to Interpol laying out instruments around the country signing up to prevent, detect, investigate, and disrupt. What we should be able to do as Interpol is a neutral interlocutor that only deals with crime. So anything that's politically, military, racist, or religious, we can't be involved in. So as soon as we hit any of those, countries can't use our tool sets. But when it's crime, that's fair. I'm still waiting to hear back from the country that unsealed those indictments. So what we then have to, coming back to your point there, Johnny, really is we've got to start shifting that law enforcement way of working. It's not the local crime type that we're dealing with. And this is where the new convention will come into that as well. So this is a staged process. It's going to take many, many years. And I think, looking at how law enforcement sometimes takes a while to adopt and adapt, and the criminals, adopt and adapt very quickly. Trust underpins all of this. So whether you're a criminal, you've got trusted groups, whether you're law enforcement, you've got trusted groups, whether you're private partners, you've got trusted groups, and you've got to build that trust effectively. And also you've got to show operational outcomes. You've got to show it works. Or if it didn't work, why didn't it work? And that comes to that two-way process of testing as well.
And it sounds like moving forward, what's going to happen is a lot of these countries and nation states are going to have to start putting pressure on these other ones that aren't doing the cooperation, right? And trying to get them to change their process.
And I think we've seen this, John, with the counter ransomware initiative, that started up initially as US piece of work to bring together different agencies in the US. But actually, then you have a number of like-minded countries come together, and Anne Neuberger, she's running that piece. And the umbrella now is there's 3 pillars to that. So there's a policy track, which is the UK and Singapore. So what are the policies that can be looked at? The second track is Nigeria running the capacity side and Germany running the diplomacy side. And then the final track is run by Australia, and that's the International Counter-Ransomware Task Force. So now you have a group of countries come together with a common threat they are trying to counter. And the question was asked, well, what about those countries, if they have criminals in those countries are committing ransomware attacks, could they join the counter-ransomware initiative? And he said, yes, they can. They have to and want to join it, and they will come. But the counter ransomware initiative, the clue's in the title, it is to counter ransomware. So it is to disrupt. So again, we need to look at what the countries are currently there. Interpol is now a member of the counter ransomware initiative. So again, we're using our sort of neutrality part to say, okay, how can Interpol best be used within this space? How can our tools and platforms? It's crime. That's what we're looking at the moment. It is there to reduce harm, to protect communities. So coming back to that clear messaging effectively.
No, I think it's fantastic. It's that first principles thinking, right? You guys are working back from the problem and then creating capacity building, training, engagement, policy development, anything that you can actually leverage or participate in towards that goal, right? So, the counter ransomware is one example, but I think it's everything that you guys are doing as a whole is very interesting. Is working backwards. I think, even going back to the time when I was with the Secret Service, we did a lot of training for the OES and training for Interpol and stuff like that. And I think very important for us to do the capacity building for our partners in country to help us out with investigations. But I think making it a much broader sort of effort, being and having Interpol being that centerpiece, I think is fantastic, because you're absolutely right. You can go in and train fiscales in Colombia, or you can, cybercrime agents in Europe. If they're not going to immediately apply those skill sets on an active campaign or operation that has some measurable results, it dissipates. To your point, yes, law enforcement, that's what we do. We collect plaques and trainings and so forth like that. And so I think this is phenomenal. I think tying the training and the capacity building to an operational, goal or operation period is fantastic.
And I think that, just following up on that point as well, that sustainability model. So whilst we're building a desk in Africa, we want to build a desk in America. So Ameripol are looking to set up an America Cybercrime Center. So we help support that. And, that's been set up in Buenos Aires now. Now that's for the Americas region. So the US, Canada and CARICOM aren't part of that, but we are. So we will have that as an Interpol Americas desk. But again, then we need the investment. And what we look at is, in terms of funding, to run a desk, just to put some figures on this for people, it's round about $1.8 million per year for about 10 or 12 staff, seconded and contract. The tools are there now. So our members pay for the tools anyway. So the tools are all there. This is about getting the people into those positions, and then the countries prioritizing that. So allowing Interpol to lead on those activities, but then the member countries providing the staffing or also the investigation side into this. So once we do that training, we then continue to build on that. And it's not always going to be leading to those arrests. The trainings we will do will be the disruption piece as well. So that's the longer term model. And again, we've got good case examples now that it works. So if we were to put that out across 4 regions, you're talking for under $10 million a year, you would have a truly global network. When we look at some of the investments going on in government, etc., and don't get me wrong, there's lots of different priorities in this. And of course, I'm going to be talking about the cyber because that's what I'm doing, and I'm looking at it from my business sense point of view. But we've got to take that funding and make it more sustainable as well. And that's when, part of my next work here is to take the US cyber security implementation plan, and I will pick through that, and we'll look at which parts of that on the international side could then be, okay, well, here's Interpol, we can support this, and actually we can drive it through the counter ransomware initiative. But I know you have different departments funding in different countries, and sometimes that does cause some difficulties as well. But that's why we're in these jobs, to sort of solve some of those challenges.
Yeah.
Are you currently talking to the Secret Service's National Computer Forensics Institute, NCFI? Because that would be a great button for you guys to connect with. I mean, great guys I used to work with.
Absolutely. I think, again, comes back to that triangle model. We've got to identify the right people and the right kind of, and another factor in this is COVID. We effectively had 2.5 years of lockdown, so we did a lot of our work like this, and we know, and I've seen it at the UN piece, we've been involved in person in the UN piece from the start. We've built up 2 years of trust within this process. And you can just have a coffee with someone, you can have a discussion with someone, and it's a lot. There is that policing aspect is when you police the community, you walk out into the community, you talk with the community. When we look in the cyber piece of this, the police are not in that community. So that's why working with your organisation and other organisations, the reliance on that creating community to protect communities, it's that change in that sort of police model. It's still the same. We want to stop bad people hurting other people, or we want to stop the money. And again, I think when we look at that cybersecurity industry and other conferences I've been to, I'm listening to it, I'm thinking, wow, this is just the same as a police conference. You're talking about, but you've got the technical capabilities. But again, then you're in a competitive market as well. So there is a different element to this. I do appreciate that.
Yeah, Craig, we could probably keep this going for hours, but we're probably going to have to wrap up just a little bit. But a couple of things, obviously, anything you want to tell our audience to kind of wrap this thing up?
Yeah, because I've got a bilat with the Indian delegation in a minute, so I've got to run it. I mean, for me, it's more about awareness. It's been able to sort of, as Interpol, this is what we're doing. It's not perfect, but it's good. It's better to have something that's good than waiting to get something that's perfect. I think that the key thing, though, is how we work with the private sector. We can't do this without the private sector, whether it's in terms of sharing those detections or those key pointers to start with, and then everybody taking their part within this. This is a big community, and there's some fantastic work going out there. So picking out those things that have worked and then trying to amplify that, because quite often things work at a very local level. How do we amplify that on a global level? But also, how do we then take that into countries that don't have those capabilities or capacity? So how do we, and what's our best way in supporting those countries to make them a bit safer? As we know, I think the adage is you get about 80% of the cybersecurity piece right, you prevent a heck of a lot of stuff. So for me, the key to this is prevention, effectively.
Yeah, and this kind of reminds me of something that our founder and CEO Eva Chen has always driven home to us, is that our competitors aren't the Symantec's or the Kaspersky's out there. It's the malicious actors. It's the adversaries, and that's why we have for years tried to support law enforcement with investigations, and because we feel that the one deterrent is get them off the street, get them into jail, right? So the more we can do that, like you said, there's not enough arrests. So hopefully, with all the work you're doing with the UN and with and globally, Interpol is going to hopefully help us get to the point where we can actually make more arrests, and we'll do our part by helping you with those.
No, in fact, we really Jon, we really appreciate the partnership we have with Trend Micro and our other partners as well. And this is about creating that two-way work, and we're doing it a lot more effectively now than we were previously. But there's a lot more to do as well.
Absolutely.
That's great. And Ed, any last thoughts?
No, I just wanted to thank Craig, one, for coming on. I mean, it's a fantastic and it's a great pleasure for us. But also, Craig, thank you for all the work that you do, your team. And, we're often ready for the next operation. Just, put us in, coach. Ready to go.
already working on it.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, guys.
And
Really good
Craig,
to
we'd
speak
love
with
to have you on another episode later down the road. We can talk, obviously there's a lot of topics we can talk about, and love to get into the whole crypto and financial aspect of things. So, everybody, thank you for joining us on episode 24 of Trend Talks BizSec. Craig Jones, Director of Cybercrime at Interpol, great guest today. Lots of great information, and have a great day, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you all very much. Take care and stay safe. Thank you.